Hi, I'm Sandy. In this session, we're going to look at some of Flow's unconnected connectors. By that, I mean triggers and actions that don't actually connect to an external service. As you probably know, Flow has over 200 connectors to external services. But sometimes there are things that you want to do in your Flow that don't require one of these external services, and that's what we're going to look at today, sort of a whirlwind tour. So there are some basic categories that we're going to talk about, and we'll look at examples of each. They're a little bit random, but I think you'll find them useful. So the first one is flow buttons. This is a trigger that you can use to start a flow without having a trigger action actually happening. You're manually triggering the flow, and you can include inputs in this trigger. You can just trigger it by itself, but you can also have text, Boolean, file, email, and number inputs that the user can add when they trigger the flow. And then, of course, those inputs can be used later in the flow. You can also trigger them on your mobile device through a flow button on your phone. So, for example, on the Flow Conference flow button, I've added some inputs of different data types. So I could, the user, when they click that button on their phone, they could enter the purpose. There's a happy yes or no, an email address to be emailed to later, a rating, which is a number, and file content lets you actually select files or images from your phone. The third screen there shows an example of uploading a file from either the camera on the phone or a photo library. You can also include flow buttons which connect to physical buttons, but those are part of the external services, so we're not going to talk about them. The next type is notifications. These are actions. One is a mobile notification and the other is an email notification. And one thing to note here is that the notification goes to you, that is the Flow creator. So there is not a way in the notifications to have it notify someone else, but it's just to notify the creator of the Flow. And an example of the mobile notification is there's just a send me a mobile notification, and that could happen, anywhere in the flow, and you can include a link in the mobile notification. And what will happen then is you get a little pop-up on your phone, and it will usually buzz at you. This is, of course, if you have the Flow mobile app. And another thing to note is that the notifications will only come in on your phone if you're currently connected to the tenant, to the Office 365 tenant where the Flow was built. If you happen to be connected to a different tenant, then you're not going to get the notifications. And then I have an example of what the notification looks like, and then I can view, and in this case, the view is of a SharePoint list, and so it goes right to the mobile SharePoint experience. You can also get a notification. In this case, this is a Flow template that's on the Flow website. I find this one really useful personally. You can get a push notification when you receive an email from your boss. Of course, it doesn't have to be your boss. It can be anybody that you don't want to miss an email from. I don't know about you, but I have, I think, 4 different email accounts that where I get emails on my phone, and I get the email notifications, but of course there are so many that I don't want to miss ones from somebody important. So I've got Flow set up that I get a Flow notification if I get an email from particular senders that I definitely don't want to miss. The next type are control actions. These are actions that add logic. This is a fairly recent addition where the Flow team has put things like conditions and looping under one umbrella called control actions. So the first one we'll look at briefly is the condition control. And you'll find that when you go to add an action in Flow, this is at the top of the list of sort of popular actions so that it's still easy to get to. You don't have to go to control and then condition. But basically a condition lets you test something to be true or false. So as an example here, I had the purpose input on that flow button flow that I had earlier. And so since that's a text value, then I can, in the condition, check for is it equal to or does it contain certain text or begin with certain text and so on. If that was a Boolean value that I was testing, then I can just test whether it's true or false. If it was numeric, then I can test things like if it's greater than or less than some value. And of course, the value that you're comparing to could also be a dynamic value. There's an advanced mode also with conditions, and I have a link there that shows you how you can use expressions within conditions. If you just enter a condition and then click on Edit in Advanced Mode, you can get an idea of what that advanced mode looks like. But the type of thing that lets you do is, for example, test conditions on multiple values and so on. The next one is apply to each. This is a looping control, and so this is typically used whenever there are multiple items. And in fact, Flow will automatically add an apply to each loop anytime you are using something that has multiple items. So as an example, here I'm getting attachments from emails that come in. So on a new email, it's going to do an apply to each attachment because, of course, there could be multiple attachments to an email. And in each case, then within the apply to each loop, it's going to, in this case, create a file in OneDrive and save those attachments using the name and the content of the attachments that came in on the email. I find this to be a really useful flow also because then my inbox isn't all cluttered up with attachments, or rather I don't have to go searching for them. I can go to my OneDrive and search for them that way. Another type of loop is a do until loop, and that lets you repeat what's inside the loop until some condition is met. So as an example, you could create a record and then wait until some field in that record has some value, such as approved, and then continue the flow. So the do until is sort of like a wait until, in a way. Scope is a way to group actions together, and then you can collapse them so that your flow diagram is kind of neater and simpler. And you can also, within that scope, set a run after for that whole set of grouped actions. So in other words, you could have that whole set of things run after the step before it had timed out or failed, for example. There's a good example of using scopes on Peter Veenstra's blog. I have a link there on the slide where he's using scopes to create a try, catch, and finally pattern, which is a common use among developers. Another control is the switch control. That is different from the condition in that it lets you perform different actions based on multiple values rather than just true false. So in this example, we have a switch on the importance of an incoming email. So if it's a high importance or low importance, or then there's always a default case, which is none of the above. But depending on what the importance of the email is. In this case, I'm creating a planner task in different buckets in Planner. But of course, you could do multiple other things. Anything where you have multiple values that you're testing. And the last control we're going to look at is Terminate. That terminates your flow. And that's helpful during testing. For example, if you don't really need the whole flow to run every time that you're running a test, or you could use it inside a condition so that the flow will only continue if the condition is met. And then notice on the status, there are actually 3 different statuses that you can select from. There's failed, canceled, or succeeded. And so, for example, if you choose failed, or actually canceled too, I believe, then if the flow terminates, if it reaches that terminate action, then it'll show as a failed flow. But you could choose succeeded, meaning that yes, you really meant it to do that, and but you just want it to terminate. And on the failed option, and also if you add a custom status, you can add an error code and a message, which then you could view what that error code and message were in the flow run after it has run and terminated. Of course, you can't access those further on in the flow because the flow has terminated. But it's a handy action. Next, we'll look at some date and time and scheduling sorts of actions. So first is the schedule. And there's a trigger here called Recurrence, and then also some actions. So the Recurrence trigger lets you actually begin a flow based on some recurrence. It could be, as you see on the frequency, anything from so many seconds to so many months. So you could have something that actually recurs once a year on at a certain time. If you do it every 12 months, for example. And you can set a start time too, so you can get pretty advanced with this. So like you could have something that triggers once a week on Wednesday at 4 o'clock in the morning, as an example. This could be something like where you're checking, every so often you want to check values in a SharePoint list and see, whether something is coming up soon. I've used that before to sort of extend Flow's 30-day limitation by setting a flag value in SharePoint list items. So once a week, I check and see whether a date is within the next week. And if it is, I set the value to, this is a upcoming, a near-term event, I should say. And then based on when that, if it has changed to a near-term event, then I trigger another flow that does whatever actions I wanted it to do when it's been waiting for 3 months or something like that. The delays are actions, and that lets you either delay for some period of time, like so many seconds or up to months, and then something happens, or you can delay until a date and time. So in that case, you have to put in some sort of timestamp that says when you want to delay until. And most often, of course, you would probably have that be a piece of dynamic data, such as one of the DateTime actions. So basically what these are there are equivalent expressions for each of them, and you can see that on the right side there. But the Flow team has created these DateTime actions to make it a little easier to use than those equivalent expressions. So for example, there's the add to time action, which is equivalent to there's an add days and add minutes and add hours. So those are separate functions in the expressions, but in the add to time action, you get to just choose from a drop down, whether you want it days and what's your interval. And then you can use the output of that, for example, in a delay until. So in this example, it's taking the created date from a SharePoint item and waiting 5 days or adding 5 days to that and then delaying until that calculated time. In other words, the 5 days. And that is a timestamp type of output. So that's what the delay until action requires. That's as opposed to having a function that says add days and then of the create item trigger, comma 5. So it's just a little more intuitive to use. And as you can see, there are multiple actions such as convert time zone, converting a time zone from, for example, to your current time zone from the time zone where an item was created, for example. You can get the current time, a future time, or a past time, and then you can subtract from time just like you can add. Next, we'll look at data operations. These are different actions to manipulate data. First up is compose, and that can be used to construct a value that's usually based on dynamic data, so that you can simplify, have more simple tokens later in actions or expressions. So you have the compose action and you can put whatever in that input. So that could be expressions, it could be text, it could be just things that you type. You can actually type in an array like with square brackets and with commas in between each of the array values, and then that compose, the output of the compose then in that case would be an array. So that it's the output that then you can use later on in the flow. And this is typically used if you have a value that's not going to change. In other words, you want to create this value. So maybe you're even doing something like constructing a URL. You could use the compose for that, kind of adding together these different bits to create a URL, and then use that later on, just being able to use that single token rather than have the whole function wherever you're trying to use it. In the example here, I'm using compose to extract just the 2-digit year from the start date of an event, and then the output of that compose is just a 2-digit year, like 18, and then that can be used as perhaps a column in a SharePoint list. The create CSV table and HTML table are kind of similar. They each create a table from a JSON array, and then with the object being that then you can use that table output in, for example, an email. So in the example given here, I'm creating an HTML table from an action which got group members of an Azure AD group. And then in the create HTML table action, you can choose to include headers, so that gives you a nicely formatted table with headers. And then the columns, you can either have the built-in columns, just the default, or you can say custom, where you can label your own headers if you want to sort of give aliases to those headers. And so in this case, it's going to just list the name and the email coming out of that. And also if you only want to show certain ones of the columns, maybe you don't need to show all of the columns. And then in this example, in an email later, then you can just put that in the body And then that gives you a nice HTML table, in this case listing all of the members of a selected AD group. The filter array is another data operation action that is working on an array and allowing you to filter it, as it sounds like. So the idea being that you could reduce the number of things in your array so that just matching criteria that you provide. So the certain array element where it matches some particular value. Join and select kind of are two additional data operations. Join lets you delimit an array with some separator, with maybe a different separator. So for example, maybe you get back from some action an array that has commas in between email addresses, but you'd like to change those to semicolons so that you can use that in the to field of an email. So you can use the join to do that. And then select lets you in some way transform the objects in an array. So for example, adding, removing, or renaming elements, but just to be aware that you can't, with the select, you can't change the total number of elements, but you can like add one and remove one, but you can't change the total number. And then Parse JSON is used to, if you have a JSON array, a JSON input that coming from some other action, then you can define a schema in the Parse JSON action. And what you would normally do is have a part of the flow that you run initially so that you can get what the typical output of the action that outputs JSON is, and then copy that into the use sample payload to generate schema. That'll give you a window to copy that sample payload into, and then it generates the JSON schema that you see there, so you don't have to actually know what that schema is. And then in subsequent actions, then that then gives you the ability to access those items from the JSON. So for example, if there was an object in there called web URL, for example, then that lets you access that as that name, as web URL. I have a link there to John Liu's blog. He uses Parse JSON a lot and has some good examples and discussion on how to go about using this and why. And lastly, we'll look at variables. So variables are all actions, and they allow you to set values. So you would use a variable when the value will probably be changing during the flow. So unlike compose, which would be used to set some sort of static value, a variable would typically change throughout the flow. You would always have to initialize a variable first, so use the initialize variable action, and that basically declares what type of data it's going to be. You see you've got choices like Boolean, integer, string, array. Your variable can be any of those things, and you can set an initial value for it if you care to also. And then you would use set variable to set a new value. So somewhere else in the flow, probably after some other action has taken place, then you could set this variable to some dynamic value that came from some other action. I have a link here to Serge Luca's blog, and he here is showing how to use variables to implement a state workflow, which Flow doesn't have natively, but basically by setting variables to different values depending on what state things are in, you can basically implement a state machine. Another thing you can do with variables is append to them. So if they are either a string or an array, you can append, have an action to append to whatever the variable is. So in this example, I've got a variable called recipients that is recipients of an email, and it's based on a multi-value user field in SharePoint, in a SharePoint list in this case. And so because it's multi-value, there can be multiple users listed in that field. Then there's an apply to each loop, apply to each recipient. And within that loop, we can append to that string variable, the recipients, the next recipient's email. So one of those other, each user that was named in the SharePoint list, and with a comma at the end so that it makes a nice list. And then the way I'm using that is in an email later on, letting somebody know that in this case, a transmittal was sent to all of the following people. And so it has that variable recipients, which is then a comma delimited list of all of the recipients who received that. And lastly, you can increment or decrement variables. You would always use them I think always use them within a loop. So in this example, I'm getting items from a SharePoint list. So that means all of the items in the SharePoint list. And so there's an apply to each loop that comes after that because it's multiple items. And I'm incrementing a variable called items processed so that each time it loops through one of the items, it adds the value 1, to the items processed. And of course, I had to initialize that variable prior to entering the loop. It just initialized it as a numeric variable. And then in this case, what I'm trying to do is get attachments on each of the items in the list and basically put them into a document library as separate documents. So I want to get attachments, and of course there could be multiple attachments on each item, so that sets off another apply to each loop. And I have another variable for attachments processed, and each time it loops through that, it's going to add 1. So in the end, then I'm going to send an email that includes the values that each of those variables ended up being. X number of attachments were processed from X number of items. And that's our little brief tour of the unconnected connectors in Flow. Thanks.